The sun had barely cleared the ridgeline when Fletcher Boone spotted her. He was riding fence along the southern edge of his spread, right where the river curved like a silver snake through the cottonwoods. His horse, Dusty, had gone stock still, ears pricked forward, listening to something Fletcher couldn't yet hear. That was when the sound reached him. A voice, soft and clear, singing a tune he didn't know from somewhere just beyond the trees. He nudged Dusty forward, slow and easy, the leather reins loose in his calloused hands. This land was quiet. This was not a place where people just wandered. His boots made no sound on the damp earth as he dismounted, following the voice on foot. The closer he got, the more the song wrapped around him. It wasn't loud, but it was full of something deep and aching, a story told without words. He pushed through a final screen of willows, and then he froze. She stood ankle-deep in the cold river, her skirts hiked just above the waterline, the early sun spilling over her dark hair like honey. Her arms moved in a gentle, steady rhythm, washing what looked like a man's torn shirt against a smooth gray rock. She was singing to herself, lost in the sound, completely unaware of the man watching her from the bank. Fletcher cleared his throat. She startled like a deer, turning so fast she nearly lost her footing. The singing choked off, and her eyes, wide and wary, locked onto him. She looked to be about his age, maybe a little younger, but the way she held herself, shoulders squared and chin high, told him she was used to being alone, and used to trouble finding her. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, raising both hands slow, palms out. "Name's Fletcher Boone. I've got a place just up that ridge." Her voice was a whisper on the wind. "I didn't mean to trespass." "You're not," he said, his voice low and calm. "But this is a long way from anywhere. You lost?" She hesitated for a heartbeat, her eyes darting to the trees behind her, like she was mapping an escape. Then she gave a single sharp nod. "Yes." She stepped out of the water, her bare feet pressing into the soft mud. Her dress was worn thin, patched at the elbow and hem, but it was clean. As she got closer, Fletcher saw it. A dark, ugly stain on her left sleeve. Dried blood. He took a half step forward, his voice tight. "You're hurt." "It's not mine," she said too quickly. Her eyes dropped to the ground. "I found it. Like that." "Found what?" He pressed, his gaze flicking from her face to the torn shirt she still held clutched in her hand. Her voice went even quieter, barely audible over the river's murmur. "My brother's coat. He's gone." Fletcher's chest tightened with a familiar ache. "I'm sorry." She just nodded, not looking up. "What's your name?" She hesitated again, a long, drawn-out silence. Marbeth Zeller." He nodded once, taking her in, really taking her in. She was alone, clearly spooked, and far too proud to ask for help. But he saw the truth in the details. The slight tremble in her fingers, the way her thumb rubbed against her palm. A nervous habit that betrayed the calm she was fighting to project. He saw the faint, bruised shadow under her eye that her hair didn't quite cover. She was telling a story, but it wasn't the whole one. "You hungry?" he asked, changing the subject. Her eyes flicked up, cautious and sharp. "I've got food at the ranch," he said. "It's dry. It's safe." She glanced toward the trees again, weighing her chances, weighing him. He could see the calculation in her eyes. Man or monster? Friend or foe? "I'll walk with you," he offered, his voice gentle. "You can ride if you want, or walk. Either way, nobody's going to touch you." After a moment that stretched an eternity, she gave another small, reluctant nod. "I'll walk." So he led Dusty by the reins and kept pace beside her, careful not to crowd her, giving her space. The silence was thick as they climbed the low ridge. He noticed she kept glancing at him sideways, her expression unreadable, still deciding if he was the kind of trouble she was running from, or the kind she could run to. He had a feeling it wouldn't be long before he found out. The ranch came into view as the morning sun climbed higher. A sturdy log house, a barn, and a good stretch of pasture that he'd carved out of the wilderness with his own 2 hands. He'd built most of it after his wife, Sarah, died 3 winters ago, leaving him with their little boy, Amos. The boy was 5 now, all wild energy and bright eyes, and he was waiting on the porch, swinging a stick like a sword. "Papa!" he yelled, launching himself down the steps. Then he stopped dead when he saw Marbeth. He froze, his little face a mask of curiosity and suspicion. Fletcher crouched and opened his arms. "Come on, Amos." The boy ran and hugged him hard, then peeked at Marbeth from the safety of his father's arms. "This is Miss Zeller," Fletcher said, his voice soft. "She's going to stay for a bit." Amos blinked up at her, his head tilted. "Are you a princess?" Marbeth looked startled, then a ghost of a smile touched her lips as she shook her head. "No." "You look like one," Amos declared. For the first time, Fletcher saw something shift in her eyes, a flicker of warmth that hadn't been there before. "Go wash up," Fletcher told the boy. "We'll eat in the kitchen." Inside, Marbeth sat stiffly at the big wooden table while Fletcher fried up potatoes and eggs. She kept glancing around the room, at the windows, at the door, as if the walls might close in on her. But she didn't try to run. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said as they ate, his tone even. "No questions you don't want to answer." She looked down at her plate, her dark hair hiding her face. "Thank you." Amos, having decided she wasn't a threat, leaned on the table, staring at her intently. "Do you know any stories?" "I know a few," she said quietly. "Can you tell me one tonight?" She looked at Fletcher, a silent question in her eyes, as if asking for permission. He nodded. "You don't have to, but he'll ask again anyway." She gave another small nod. "All right." That night, long after Amos was asleep and the fire had burned down to glowing embers, Fletcher stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and crisp. A moment later, Marbeth followed, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. "I know I should leave," she said softly, her voice barely carrying over the chirping of the crickets. "I can find work somewhere. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," he said, his back to her, looking out at the vast, starry sky. "You don't have to go." She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I haven't felt safe for a long time." "You are now." She turned her head, and he could feel her eyes on him, searching his face in the dim light. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Fletcher turned to look at her, really look at her. The faint light spilling from the window caught the curve of her cheek, the tension in her jaw. "Because I want to be." Another silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. Then she whispered, "It feels strange." "What does?" "Not being afraid." He nodded slowly. "Give it time." She looked at him again, and this time something in her gaze was softer, less guarded, like she was finally letting herself believe him. He didn't touch her, didn't push. He just stood there beside her in the quiet of the night, a silent promise passing between them. And for the first time since he buried Sarah, Fletcher felt something new stir in his chest. It wasn't guilt, and it wasn't just duty. It was a flicker of hope, something warm, something that felt like the start of something real. But as he looked at her, at the shadows that still clung to her like a second skin, he couldn't shake the feeling that her fear wasn't gone. It was just sleeping, and he had no idea what it would take to wake it up. The next morning, Fletcher found Marbeth already outside, her sleeves rolled up and her skirt dark with dew. She was kneeling in the small garden plot, her fingers moving through the soil with a practiced ease. A neat pile of weeds sat beside her. She didn't flinch when he stepped down from the porch. "You don't sleep in much, do you?" he said. "There's work to be done," she replied, not looking up. I can do it. You don't have to. I didn't bring you here to be a farmhand. She brushed her hands on her apron, finally looking at him. I don't like sitting idle. It gives the mind too much time to wander. Fletcher leaned against the fence rail, studying her. Where does it wander to? Her face was a mask, impossible to read. Places I'd rather not revisit. He nodded once, accepting the wall she'd put up. Then he gestured with his chin toward the barn. I was about to mend a broken latch on the tack room door. Could use another pair of hands to hold the board steady. I'll come, she said simply, standing up and wiping her hands. They worked in silence at first, the only sounds the creak of old wood and the clatter of a dropped nail. He noticed how economical her movements were, nothing wasted. She didn't ask questions, just did what was needed, her focus absolute. It was the focus of someone who knew that a single mistake could have devastating consequences. You grew up on a farm? He asked after a while, breaking the quiet. She kept her eyes on the board she was holding steady for him. My father kept goats back in Pennsylvania, hilly land. Not much good for crops, but the animals did all right. He glanced at her, catching her profile. What brought you so far west? He saw her jaw tense, a tiny muscle twitching. My brother, he had ideas. Big ones. She let out a short, sharp breath. He thought there were places out here where a man could start over. Be left alone. Build something worth keeping. Fletcher hammered the last nail into place and stepped back, wiping his hands on his trousers. That sounds a lot like what brought me here. She dusted her palms together. Did it work? He thought about it for a moment, his gaze drifting over the land he'd bled for. Some parts. Other parts I'm still figuring out. A week turned into 2. Marbeth settled into the rhythm of the ranch like she'd always been there. She was quiet, but her presence was a steady, calming force. She helped with chores without being asked. She told Amos stories before bed, her voice a low murmur that filled the small house with a warmth it hadn't known in years. Fletcher found himself watching her, learning the language of her silences. He saw the way she'd sometimes freeze at a sudden noise, the way her eyes would dart to the tree line at dusk. She was safe, but she wasn't settled. Not yet. One evening, after supper, she stood by the door, watching the sky bleed from orange to purple. The light caught in her hair, and Fletcher paused on his way to the barn, just to look at her. You ever think of going back east? He asked. She didn't turn. There's nothing left there for me. He stepped closer, his boots silent on the wooden porch. You thinking of leaving here? She was quiet for a long moment. Not yet. You could stay, he said, the words feeling heavier than he expected. She turned then, her face cast in soft shadow. I don't want to be a guest forever, Fletcher. You're not, he said, his voice rough. This place, it's steadier with you in it. Her eyes searched his face, cautious, but the fear was gone, replaced by something else, something he couldn't quite name. You don't know all of me yet. I know enough, he said. I know enough to want to learn the rest. A month after she arrived, a rider appeared on the horizon, not a neighbor, not a friendly face. This man was different. He rode a tall, black horse and wore a long, dark coat, despite the growing warmth of the day. He sat in the saddle with a stillness that spoke of authority and danger. Amos saw him first and ran inside, his voice a panicked whisper. Papa, there's a man coming! Fletcher stepped onto the porch, his hand instinctively resting on the axe handle leaning against the wall. He saw Marbeth freeze in the garden, her face going pale as chalk. She looked from the rider to Fletcher, and in her eyes he saw the raw, naked fear she'd been holding back for weeks. The stranger rode right up to the fence and stopped, his cold eyes taking in the whole ranch in a single sweeping glance. He wasn't a lawman, not officially. He had the hard, unyielding look of a Pinkerton agent, or something worse. "Fletcher Boone?" the man called out, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "That's me." The man's gaze slid past Fletcher and landed on Marbeth, who stood frozen like a statue among the potato plants. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "I'm looking for a woman, goes by the name of Marbeth Zeller. Seems my search is over." Fletcher felt a cold dread wash over him. He stepped in front of the door, blocking the man's view of the house, of Amos peeking through the window. He looked back at Marbeth, and he saw it clearly now. She wasn't just running from a memory. She was running from him. "She's under my protection," Fletcher said, his voice a low growl. The man on the horse laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Is she now? You might want to ask her what she needs protecting from." He swung down from his horse, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. He never took his eyes off Marbeth. "The name's Reed, and Mrs. Zeller and I have some unfinished business to discuss." "Mrs. Zeller, not Miss." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Fletcher looked at Marbeth, whose face was ashen. The story she'd told him, the story of a lost brother, began to unravel in his mind. The blood on the coat, the haunted look in her eyes. It was all a lie. And the truth, he suspected, was far darker and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Reed took a step toward the fence. "Her husband, Silas Zeller, sent me to collect what's his." Fletcher's blood ran cold. Husband? He'd never mentioned a husband. Marbeth stood motionless, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of her gardening spade. "Silas is dead," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. Reed's smile widened. "Oh, I know. I was the one who found the body, shot in the back, not 2 miles from where you abandoned his camp." He looked directly at Fletcher, his eyes glinting with malice. "Looks like you've taken in a murderer, Mr. Boone, a cold-blooded killer, and I'm here to bring her to justice." The world seemed to shrink around Fletcher, the peaceful quiet of his ranch shattered by this man's words. He looked at Marbeth, this quiet, gentle woman who told his son stories, who worked the earth with patient hands. A killer? It didn't seem possible. But the terror in her eyes told him that, whatever the truth was, Reed was a part of it, and he had brought the past she was so desperate to escape right to her doorstep. "She's not going anywhere with you," Fletcher said, his voice steady despite the hammer in his chest. He took a step forward, positioning himself between Reed and the house, between Reed and Marbeth. Reed's cold eyes flickered with amusement. "Brave, man, but foolish. You have no idea what you're getting into." He unbuttoned his long coat, revealing the butt of a pistol tucked into his belt. "This isn't a discussion." Marbeth finally moved, taking a shaky step back. "Fletcher, don't. He's not who he says he is." "Oh, but I am," Reed sneered. "I'm the man who knows everything. I know how Silas mistreated you. I also know about the payroll he was carrying, a tidy little sum he and I were supposed to secure. But Silas got greedy, and then he turned up dead, and the money was gone. Funny how that works." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't about justice. It was about money, a stolen payroll. Reed didn't think Marbeth was just a murderer. He thought she was a thief. He thought she had his money. "I don't have any money," Marbeth said, her voice rising with desperation. "Silas never told me about any money." "Liar!" Reed's face twisted into an ugly snarl. He lunged for the fence gate, his hand reaching for his pistol. "The money is the only reason you'd have the guts to kill him. Now you're going to tell me where it is." But Fletcher was faster. He swung the heavy axe handle he'd been holding, not to kill, but to warn. The wood cracked against the fence post inches from Reed's head, the force of the blow sending splinters flying. Reed stumbled back, his eyes wide with surprise and fury. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, rancher." "Get in the house, Marbeth," Fletcher commanded, never taking his eyes off Reed. Amos, get away from the window! She hesitated for a second, then turned and ran for the porch. Reed recovered quickly, drawing his pistol. "Nobody moves!" he roared. But it was too late. Marbeth was inside, the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind her. Fletcher stood his ground, the axe handle held ready. The peaceful ranch had become a battlefield, a siege, and he was standing between a desperate man with a gun and the woman he had, in the space of a few short weeks, come to care for more than he was willing to admit. He was protecting a woman who had lied to him from the very beginning, a woman who was maybe a killer, maybe a thief. But as he faced down the barrel of Reed's gun, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that she was inside his house, with his son, and he would die before he let Reed get to either of them. The standoff stretched into a tense, unbearable silence, broken only by the wind whistling through the pines. Reed stood by the fence, pistol aimed squarely at Fletcher's chest. His face was a mask of cold fury. "You can't protect her forever, Boone. I've got all the time in the world. I'll wait until you starve, until you run out of water. Sooner or later, you have to come out. And when you do, I'll get my answers. And my money." "There is no money," a voice cried from the house. It was Marbeth. She had opened the door, just a crack. "I swear on my life I don't know anything about a payroll." "Then you'll have to convince me," Reed said, his voice dangerously soft. "Let's start by you telling your new friend here the real story, not the fantasy about your poor, lost brother." Fletcher's grip tightened on the axe handle. He didn't turn to look at Marbeth. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of her secrets pressing in on him. "Marbeth," he said, his voice low, "tell me." The door opened wider, and she stepped out onto the porch, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fire he hadn't seen before. She looked not at Fletcher, but at Reed. "My brother was real," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "His name was Samuel, and he was a good man, a better man than Silas could ever dream of being." Reed laughed. "A convenient story." "It's the truth," she cried. "Silas was my husband, a monster who took pleasure in my pain. Samuel tried to help me escape. He came for me a week before I ran, but Silas was waiting for him." Her voice broke, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "Silas killed him. He killed my brother right in front of me. And the bloody coat. The coat I was washing in the river. It was Samuel's." The confession hit Fletcher like a physical blow. The lie she had told him was a shield, not a deception. She wasn't protecting herself from what she had done. She was protecting the memory of her brother, and she was hiding from the man who had murdered him, her husband. "Silas made me wear it," she whispered, her voice raw with grief. "He said it would be a reminder of what happens to people who try to help me." Fletcher's heart ached for her, for the horror she had endured. But Reed was unmoved. "A touching story, but it doesn't change the facts. Silas is dead. You were the only one there, and the money is missing." "I told you I don't have it." "Then where is it?" Reed screamed, his composure finally cracking. He took a step forward, raising his pistol again. "Where is the money, Marbeth?" "I don't know." Suddenly, a small figure darted out from behind Marbeth. It was Amos, his face streaked with tears, clutching a small carved wooden bird. "Leave her alone!" he shouted, his little voice filled with a courage that stunned them all. He threw the wooden bird with all his might. It sailed through the air and struck Reed on the side of the head. It wasn't enough to hurt him, but it was enough to distract him. For a split second, Reed's eyes flickered toward the boy. And that was all the time Fletcher needed. He lunged forward, not at Reed, but to the side, diving behind the rain barrel at the corner of the porch. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering the wood where he had been standing just a moment before. "Marbeth, get Amos inside! Now!" he yelled, scrambling for cover. She didn't hesitate, scooping up the boy and dragging him back into the house, slamming the door shut. Another shot tore through the air, embedding itself in the doorframe. Fletcher was trapped. Reed was reloading, his movements quick and efficient. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the yard. The ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison. And the warden was a killer who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Fletcher knew he had to do something, and fast. But he was out in the open, with nothing but an axe handle against a gun. The odds weren't just bad, they were impossible. Darkness fell, and a fragile truce settled over the ranch. Reed was out there, somewhere in the shadows beyond the fence, waiting. Fletcher was inside, the house dark except for the low glow of the embers in the hearth. Amos was asleep, finally cried out, curled under a blanket in the corner. Marbeth sat at the table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The silence was heavy, thick with fear and unspoken questions. "He won't give up," she whispered into the gloom. "Not as long as he thinks I have the money." "Then we have to make him believe you don't," Fletcher said, his mind racing. He was a rancher, not a gunman. He knew the land, the animals, the rhythm of the seasons. He didn't know how to fight a man like Reed, but he had to try. For Amos, for Marbeth. "You said Silas killed your brother," Fletcher said, his voice gentle. "What happened after?" She took a shaky breath. After he did it, he was panicked. Not sorry, just scared. He knew Samuel's disappearance would bring questions. He packed a bag, grabbed the strongbox where he kept the payroll, and dragged me with him. We rode for 2 days. He was jumpy, looking over his shoulder the whole time. He was looking for Reed, Fletcher realized. He was supposed to meet him, but he was running instead. He was trying to cut Reed out. "Yes," she said. "On the second night he was drunk, ranting about how he was going to start a new life, how no one would ever find him. He fell asleep with his gun on his chest. I knew it was my only chance. I took the gun, and I ran. I just ran. I didn't even look back." "You didn't shoot him," Fletcher stated, a certainty settling deep in his bones. It wasn't a question. "No," she whispered. "I couldn't. Even after everything he did, I couldn't kill him in his sleep." A new piece of the puzzle slid into place. Reed had lied. He said Silas was shot in the back, but if Marbeth didn't shoot him, who did? "Reed found him," Fletcher said, the realization dawning on him. "Silas ran, so Reed tracked him down. He found the camp. He probably saw you were gone. He and Silas argued over the money, and Reed killed him," Marbeth finished, her eyes wide with horror. "He shot his own partner in the back and then tried to pin it on me. He's been lying this whole time." The entire story had been a fabrication, a twisted narrative designed to corner her, to frighten her into revealing the location of a treasure she never possessed. Reed wasn't just a thief, he was the murderer. He had created this entire nightmare to cover his own tracks. "The money," Fletcher said, thinking aloud. If Silas was running, he wouldn't have kept it on him. He would have hidden it somewhere safe, somewhere he could come back for it later. "Where?" Marbeth asked, her voice filled with a sliver of hope. Fletcher looked around the dark room, his eyes landing on the leather satchel Marbeth had carried when she arrived. It was the only thing she had. "What was in your bag when you got here? Anything of his?" She shook her head. "Just my things. A change of clothes, my mother's lace." She trailed off, her eyes widening. She jumped up and rushed to the satchel, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the clasp. She pulled out a small, leather-bound book. A journal. "It was his," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. "I took it without thinking. I just wanted something to remember my old life by, before him." She opened the journal. The pages were filled with Silas's cramped, angry script. Business dealings, names, dates, and then, on the very last page, a hastily scrawled entry. A map. It was a crude drawing, just a few lines and an X, but the landmarks were clear. A crooked pine, a trio of boulders, a dry creek bed. It was a map to the hiding place. But it wasn't a map of Fletcher's land. The names were wrong, the landscape different. It was a map of Silas's old homestead, the one he and Marbeth had shared, the one he abandoned when he killed her brother. The money wasn't here. It had never been here. It was buried miles away, back where the whole nightmare began. They finally had the truth. They had proof. But it was trapped in the house with them, and a desperate murderer was waiting for them outside. The proof was useless if they didn't survive the night. Fletcher looked at the map, then at Marbeth. A desperate, dangerous plan began to form in his mind. It was a long shot, a gamble with their lives, but it was the only one they had. "He wants the money," Fletcher said, his voice grim. "So we're going to make him think he can get it." "What are you talking about?" Marbeth asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "We're going to give him the map," Fletcher said, "but not the real one." He grabbed a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a spare scrap of leather from his mending kit. Working quickly in the dim light, he began to draw. He copied the landmarks from Silas's map, the crooked pine, the boulders, but he changed their location. He drew a new map, a map of his own land. He marked an X deep in the ravine on the northern edge of his property, a treacherous place of loose rock and steep drops. "He doesn't know this land," Fletcher explained, his voice low and urgent. "He'll follow the map. It'll lead him right into the ravine. It's a natural trap. Once he's in there, he'll be disoriented, and the climb out is nearly impossible in the dark." "And then what?" Marbeth whispered. "Then," Fletcher said, his eyes hard as flint, "I go after him." It was a crazy plan, luring a man with a gun into a trap on his own turf, but it was better than waiting to be killed. He stood up and went to the door. "Reed!" he yelled into the darkness. "You out there?" There was a long silence, then a cautious reply from the shadows near the barn. "I'm here, Boone. Ready to be sensible?" "Marbeth has something for you," Fletcher shouted back. "She knows where the money is. She has a map." He could almost feel Reed's greed vibrating through the air. This was the moment. The bait had to be perfect. "Slide it under the door," Reed commanded, his voice tight with suspicion. "No," Fletcher replied. "She's too scared. You come to the porch, unarmed. She'll give it to you. Then you leave us alone." Another long pause. The wind rustled the leaves, making it sound like whispering voices. Fletcher held his breath. He was counting on Reed's greed being stronger than his caution. Finally, Reed's voice cut through the darkness. "All right, Boone. You win. I'm coming." Fletcher watched through a crack in the door as Reed's dark shape emerged from the shadows. He moved slowly, cautiously, his hands held out to his sides to show they were empty. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Now, where's my map?" Fletcher looked at Marbeth. Her face was a pale oval in the darkness. She took a deep breath, clutching the forged map in her hand. This was it. She opened the door just enough to toss the folded piece of leather onto the porch. It landed with a soft thud. Reed snatched it up, his eyes scanning it hungrily in the faint starlight. A greedy smile spread across his face. "The crooked pine, the boulders, it's all here." He looked up, his eyes glinting. "It's been a pleasure doing business with you." He turned and disappeared back into the darkness. For a moment, there was only silence. Then they heard it, the sound of a horse galloping away, heading north, toward the ravine. The first part of the plan had worked, but the most dangerous part was yet to come. Fletcher grabbed his heaviest hunting knife and the length of rope he kept by the door. He looked at Marbeth. "Barricade the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me. You understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Be careful, Fletcher." He slipped out the back door and melted into the familiar shadows of his own land. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, making the night a suffocating blanket of black. He moved silently, his boots making no sound on the soft pine needles. He knew these woods better than he knew the lines on his own hand. He was the predator now, and he was hunting. He followed the sound of Reed's horse, keeping to the trees. He could hear Reed cursing as he navigated the unfamiliar terrain in the dark, his greed making him reckless. Fletcher moved with a patience born of years spent tracking game. He was in no hurry. He knew exactly where Reed was going. He reached the edge of the ravine first and found a spot high on the ridge, hidden behind a cluster of granite boulders. From here he could see the entire canyon floor. He settled in to wait. It wasn't long before he saw the faint glow of a lantern below. Reed had dismounted and was making his way down the treacherous slope on foot, the map in one hand, the lantern in the other. He was following the false trail perfectly. Fletcher watched as Reed reached the spot marked with an X. It was a small alcove at the base of a sheer rock wall, a dead end. He saw Reed raise the lantern, his silhouette stark against the rock. He saw him kick at the dirt, then again his frustration growing. He heard the faint echo of Reed's enraged roar as he realized he'd been tricked. Reed spun around, raising his lantern, his eyes scanning the darkness of the ravine walls. "Boone, you bastard! I know you're out here!" Fletcher remained perfectly still, his heart pounding against his ribs. The lantern light swept across the ravine, getting closer to his hiding spot. Reed was a cornered animal now, and that made him even more dangerous. He started to climb back up the slope, his movements clumsy with rage. This was the moment Fletcher had been waiting for. As Reed scrambled over a patch of loose shale, Fletcher sent a rock skittering down the slope just to his left. Reed spun around, startled, and fired his pistol into the darkness, the shot echoing like a thunderclap through the narrow canyon. While Reed was distracted, Fletcher moved, circling around him in the darkness, using his knowledge of the terrain to stay hidden. He was hurting him, pushing him deeper into the ravine's embrace, away from the easiest path out. "Show yourself, coward!" Reed screamed, his voice raw. He fired again, wildly, the bullet ricocheting off the rock walls. Fletcher waited. Patience was his weapon. He let Reed exhaust himself, let the fear and the darkness work on him. Finally, Reed's frantic energy gave way to exhaustion. He slumped against a boulder, breathing heavily, his lantern flickering on the ground beside him. Fletcher began his final approach, moving like a ghost through the shadows. He was only a few feet away when a twig snapped under his boot. Reed jerked his head up, his eyes wide. He raised his pistol, but Fletcher was already on him. He lunged, not at the gun, but at the man, tackling him with all his weight. They crashed to the ground, the lantern skittering away and extinguishing, plunging them into absolute darkness. The world became a confusing maelstrom of desperate struggle. Fletcher felt a searing pain in his arm as Reed's knife found its mark. He grunted, ignoring the pain, and brought his own knife up. He wasn't trying to kill, he was trying to disarm. His blade slashed across Reed's wrist, and he heard the pistol clatter onto the rocks. The fight was raw, primal. They rolled on the ground, trading blows in the suffocating blackness. Reed was strong, fueled by rage and desperation, but Fletcher was stronger, fueled by something more powerful, the need to protect his home, his family. He finally got the upper hand, pinning Reed to the ground, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. "It's over, Reed," Fletcher rasped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You killed Silas. You lied. It's all over." In the darkness, he felt Reed begin to laugh, a wheezing, broken sound. "You think this is over? Even if you kill me, his partners will come looking. They'll tear this place apart to find that money." Partners. Plural. The conspiracy was bigger than he thought. Reed wasn't just a lone wolf. "It doesn't matter," Fletcher said, pressing down harder, "because we have the proof." He reached into his own pocket and pulled out the real prize. Not the map, not the money. It was Silas's journal. His journal, Fletcher said, his voice a low growl in the darkness. With all your names, all your plans, you weren't just stealing a payroll, you were part of a whole ring. And now, everyone's going to know. The laughter stopped. Fletcher could feel the sudden, crushing weight of defeat settle on the man beneath him. It was finally over. He used the rope he'd brought to tie Reed's hands and feet. Then he retrieved the pistol and the journal. The first rays of dawn were breaking as he dragged his prisoner out of the ravine and back toward the ranch. He was exhausted, bleeding, but he was victorious. Marbeth was waiting on the porch, a rifle held in her hands, her face etched with worry. When she saw him alive and with Reed as his captive, she dropped the rifle and ran to him, throwing her arms around him. "You're hurt," she whispered, her hand coming away wet with blood from his arm. "It's just a scratch," he said, pulling her close. "It's over. It's really over." They took Reed to the sheriff in town, along with the journal. The story came tumbling out, a sordid tale of greed, betrayal, and murder. The journal was the key, implicating a half-dozen other men, including a supposedly respectable town official. Reed's partners were rounded up, the whole corrupt ring dismantled. Marbeth was cleared of all suspicion, her name finally free from the shadow of Silas Zeller. She was no longer a victim on the run, she was a survivor. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the world feeling new and clean. When they arrived, Amos ran out to meet them, his face bright with relief. He hugged Fletcher, then he turned and hugged Marbeth, burying his face in her skirt. She knelt down and held him tight, and over his head, her eyes met Fletcher's. There were no more secrets between them, no more lies. They had faced the darkness together and had come out the other side, stronger. That evening, they sat on the porch, just as they had on her first night there, watching the stars come out. "I never thought I'd start again," she said softly. "You didn't," Fletcher said, taking her hand. His was rough and calloused. Hers was small and steady. "We started something new." They were married a month later, beneath the big cottonwood tree by the river where he had first found her. It was a quiet ceremony, just them and Amos and a few neighbors. Marbeth wore a simple blue dress, and she had sewn the lace from her mother's wedding gown into the collar. Years passed. The ranch thrived. The silence that had once been filled with fear was now filled with comfort and peace. A daughter was born. A little girl with her mother's dark hair and Fletcher's quiet, steady eyes. They named her Clara. The house that had once felt so empty was now filled with the sounds of laughter and life. One winter evening, as they sat by the fire, Fletcher asked her if she ever thought about the past. She looked up from the quilt she was mending, her expression serene. "I didn't leave a life behind me, Fletcher," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I walked toward one." And as he looked at his family, at the home they had built not just from wood and stone, but from courage and trust, he knew she was right. They had found their justice, not in revenge, but in the quiet, simple beauty of a life well lived. They had found their treasure, not buried in the dirt, but right there, in each other's arms. If you enjoyed this story of survival, justice, and the fight for a second chance, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next one.